20 years ago, a reality TV series about a struggling promotion aired on Spike TV that, for better or worse, would go on to change the landscape of sports and pop culture. This is a retrospective of that series, its key players, and its lasting legacy. This is TUFtwenty.
TUFtwenty is brought to you by The Contrarians, a movie podcast where we are right and you're wrong. Be sure to subscribe to The Contrarians on your favorite podcatcher for access to this entire series, as well as Julio and Alex's most recent film follies. Our main website, wearethecontrarians.com, houses all of our past episodes as well.
You can find The Contrarians across social media under the handle @ContrarianPrime.
It's not just us, though. As for this 14-part journey of nostalgia and shame, we've got a championship corner.
I'm Joe Hulbert, and for years I've discussed fake fighting on the internet. Now, however, I'm trying my hand at the real thing. Usually, you can find me at the Late Night Grim, but for this particular adventure, I'll be sitting under the Team Couture learning tree, providing insight to my fellow men of honor.
It's niche micro-celebrity Steve. You may know me from Twitter, the Songs with Friends podcast, or various scuffles in the world of professional wrestling. By the end of this journey, you are no doubt going to feel this, because this is the ultimate.
Now that the cage door is locked, let's get down to business.
Time to talk asparagus.
Julio, what do we love here on The Contrarians?
We love movies. We have a love-hate relationship with Rotten Tomatoes. And one of us loves wrestling while the other one tries to keep up. Actually, not even wrestling, just wrestling. I think, what would you call this, Alex? Competitive fighting sports?
Combat sports, I believe, is the preferred vernacular. We do love movies. We love Raging Against the Rotten Tomatoes machine. We love Take Me Home Tonight, the Topher Grace classic from the early 2010s. But we also love, Julio, is a good journey, as, you know, be it our Summer of Travolta, our Summer of Winona, our Roxina mega journey that we took over on our Patreon, our Lohan journey we took, clocking in, 15 hours talking about the life and times of Lindsay Lohan.
Even Lindsay Lohan was like, can you guys please stop?
She said, I have to leave the country to get you guys to stop doing this. Most recently, our Bagdana Films and PJ Parties journey took us to some unique places, but not quite as unique as what we're embarking on here, breaking our traditional formula for a 14-part miniseries in which we're traveling back to the salad days of 2004, 2005, and the when reality TV, you couldn't escape it. Now it's just like a fact of life, but back then it was still like a novelty. And we're going to revisit 20 years later the first season of The Ultimate Fighter, the reality television show that aired on Spike TV that, for better or worse, as I will say numerous times throughout this, changed the face of sports culture and in many ways pop culture. The UFC arrives into the public, the ether, the zeitgeist. But Julio, we're not coming alone. We're stepping into the cage with some comrades here from different circles of not just the internet but the world. We'll start off with Steve. You know him as @not Dr. Death, or just Steve in all caps with an exclamation point at the end. Steve, who are you? Welcome. Thank you.
I'm just a guy firing off tweets all hours of all days and all nights. But I'm here because there is no substitute for the ultimate is what's in store. Bear witness to the fitness of the modern warrior. Boom, another hit has landed. Boom, another hit has landed. The stealth of a sniper, the strength of a viper, the training, the challenge, the goddamn ultimate fighter. How are you, boys?
My God, what an introduction.
There's no way I could ever have done that. That's why Steve is here. That
is correct. And coming to us from the imperial nation of Great Britain, we have you all know him, you love him. He's possibly the draw of this whole thing besides Chuck Liddell and Randy Couture. We got Joe Hulbert. Joe, welcome. This is exciting.
It is. I wish that I went before Steve though, because that was pretty formidable. I was gonna go with like, I'm not just a guy, but then Steve did that, and it's like, now I really do feel like just a guy now. Right? But I'm most famous for being a fan of the Contrarians podcast, and of course here I am to ruin that venture, really, in sort of triumphant and fact fashion as we talk about a great combination of shame and nostalgia, which is very unique here that we're going to dive into.
It's what we live for, honestly, be it movies, as wrestling fans specifically, but, just kids of this era. That's what we live for. So Julio, we do want to let the listeners know that stay tuned. There will be movies involved in this journey over on our Patreon page. We got to pick out some MMA themed movies. So if you're here usually just for the picture discussion, that's coming. So don't worry. But the subject is MMA and specifically the Ultimate Fighting Championship. Julio, what, if anything, is your first memory or exposure to, cage fighting as it is? Was it when we did Here Comes the Boom, or had you heard of the UFC beforehand?
The first X-Men movie features Wolverine getting in the cage. I think that's his introduction, right?
It is.
Isn't that how we meet him? Getting thrown around the cage, and then I think he prevails. Other than that, we used to show every now and then the occasional UFC fight at the movie theater. Mm-hmm. And right. We would get those standees, and then my friend and colleague Alex Mattis would just take them home as soon as they were available before they were destroyed. So it was like, this must be something. And there were people attending those screenings, so I knew that there was a thing. But I've never sat down to watch a UFC fight. I've slowly become more aware of what it entails. Why is it different from boxing, wrestling, and all the other combat sports that you listed or that you alluded to earlier? But that's it. Never in my wildest dreams would I have suspected that there was a reality show dedicated to where the prize was like, now you get in the cage. I'm assuming that's what's going to happen at the end.
You get a 6-figure contract, baby.
That's right. But yeah, no, before Here Comes the Boom, there has to have been another. No, because there were other movies by then that had come out in the theaters. Never Back Down.
That's the only one, though, that has like the UFC branding in it. Because, he actually fights in the UFC. So that's
right. Yeah.
Warrior's a little bit better of a film than Here Comes the Boom, but there's no like branding in that.
Somebody from UFC makes a cameo in Grudge Match.
Oh, Chael Sonnen. I forgot about that. Boys, if you've never seen Grudge Match, Sly and Robert De Niro get in a fight with Chael Sonnen.
And they beat him.
They sure do.
All right. So Julio coming into this, a bit of a fresh slate. One of the reasons I picked one of our guests here, Steve, is because I felt like I had remembered he and I in the past having some, jokes about the first season of The Ultimate Fighter. Specifically, I believe, Steve, did you watch this in real time as well?
I did. I picked up when the Koscheck Lieben gimmick started. So roughly episode 5-ish. And then I quickly, because of the nature of Spike TV back then, was able to catch up in the course of a weekend over every episode that it aired.
Prior to that, what was your first experience with UFC and MMA? The original run of VHSs that you could go to the video store and rent? Or did you ever watch any of the pay-per-views?
I did not. I was aware of the pay-per-views through advertisements in the wrestling magazines and pay-per-view Barker channel commercials that would air back then. And it looked like people were just getting murdered. So I was 12 and I wanted in on that action. But I couldn't afford to get the pay-per-views. I actually got several of the VHSs later, circa 98, 99. I recall the advertisements in the magazine seemed to end around the Ultimate, which would have been like late 96. So I thought that it was like a series finale for UFC. It turns out they had become staunch political opponents of the world and were banned from just about everything but satellite.
Yes.
So I recall catching the occasional fight on, was it Fox Sports Net maybe? In the afternoons in the early 2000s. Mm-hmm. And I remember a buzz among my coworkers regarding the Shamrock Ortiz fight circa 2002. Mm-hmm. But other than that, outside of like GameCube games, I didn't really have any contact with Ultimate Fighting Championship until the Ultimate Fighter started in 2005.
The Julio, what he was referencing is it's true. Like John McCain was on a quest to shut down the Ultimate Fighting Championship. It was not looked favorably upon by politicians.
Oh, man.
The public in general, for good reason. The early UFCs had no rules, no time limits or anything. The first fight in UFC history, a guy trips and falls and then gets soccer kicked and his teeth go flying out. That's the first thing that happens on a UFC broadcast.
But you do sign a release before you get into that cage, right?
They actually would kidnap people and then blindfold them and just unleash them into the cage.
Okay, now I'm siding with McCain. That's not America.
It was like the scene in Old School when they were kidnapping the pledges Back of the van.
Tie a brick around their hand. Joey, Bing Bong, bit younger than the rest of the panel here, but you and I, when we discovered, we met each other through wrestling, but discovered that we both have a wealth of MMA knowledge and no one else to really discuss it with. So that's a bonding point of ours. What do you remember as like your first exposure, your earliest, viewing of the Ultimate Fighting Championship or MMA in general?
I was pondering this. Yeah. So this is one of those deals where, because I've watched so much stuff, going back, that it blends together very much. I would say around a year or two following this, I would say, which is hilarious considering my age at that point, but these are the games we play. But I would say it's when like Rampage emerges in the UFC, which, I mean, is in the division we're going to be talking about here in terms of the coaches, but obviously it's a little bit down the line. I probably saw this season, I would say, around 2008, 2009, because this is when when I would get into something, and this is clearly carried on throughout life, you go all in, right? I couldn't do, so you had all the DVD sets and such, and a lot of this season is familiar to me, even though I've seen it once, probably like 15 years ago now, which is frightening to say out loud. But yeah, so that's where I think I'm at. And look, I mean, it will get more embarrassing. I'm going to admit this now as we go through this, but the Ultimate Fighter was a big part in shaping your fandom. It was like anyone who got in that time range. And I don't really know why looking back, because I think a lot of the legacy of this show, I think, is immediately questioned by the first episode, which we're about to cover. But it was a huge part of the promotion's personality, right? And I think so. This is an interesting ride in that way. It kind of leaves you conflicted legitimately. But I'd say a couple of years after this was when I became kind of all in, so to speak.
Yeah, it's and this is obviously going to be a reoccurring theme and discussion point throughout this. It cannot be stressed enough for 3 out of the 4 on this panel, our fandom being shaped by this, but also because of this show, the industry we all met through, how much it profoundly changed pro wrestling in general. And this is a lot to unpack. And like you said, yes, there's, from the very first strum of the free use metal on the first episode, it's like, oh, what the fuck are we doing, man? Come on. All right. So let's give a bit of backstory here, because we do have some listeners I know that don't know shit from apple butter about MMA and the UFC, but they like us, so they'll be listening to this. So I do want to give a bit of context here. The Ultimate Fighting Championship premiered. It escaped into the world on November 12th of 1993. Julio, do you remember which movie we covered that came out on that day? And I talked about the idea of doing a double feature.
All right, give me that date again.
November 12th, 1993. And just think of the poster and big red caps, Pacino across the top.
1983, Pacino? Jilly? No. That's 2000s.
Yeah, you got to go about a decade in the future for that one, brother.
Yeah, young Pacino. When have we covered young Pacino?
Dude, we had to cut it from the episode because I was going on about like the idea of going to see this movie and then going home to watch the UFC 1 pay-per-view.
Okay. I was thinking main feed. No, the De Palma, Carlito's Way.
Carlito's Way. Stay out of Carlito's Way. Yep, that came out the same day. So still, I reiterate, there is someone out there who went and saw Carlito's Way and then went home and watched the first UFC pay-per-view. And I want to meet that person and talk to them about their day. UFC 1, 1993. If you've never seen the first UFC event, it's shocking no matter what point in time you watch it, just from a production standpoint to what actually happens. The idea, Julio, was to find out which martial art was the best, which one conquered all. So there was a boxer, there was a wrestler, there was a Vale Tudo fighter, a kickboxer, and then, of course, a Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioner by the name of Royce Gracie that over the course of, the 2 hours this pay-per-view lasted, I think kind of transformed what people knew of fighting.
Did you get to meet M. Bison in the first match, or was that at the very end of the season?
Brother, you joke, but if you read some of the stories about like the initial like layout of what the UFC was going to be, there's like different stories if they wanted to have it like surrounded by a moat that had sharks in it, or like electrified wire and shit. So you're not too far off. Raul Julia might have just come in and announced game over. But we go through the first few years of the UFC. It is a barbaric program, but it clearly has a fan base that follows it. 1 and 2, you can see that after the initial like human interest just from the shock and awe wore off, there was still something to it. There was a bit of mainstream exposure when Ken Shamrock, who was a practitioner, who will come back up in just a moment, of mixed martial arts, went to the World Wrestling Federation, so they got some TV exposure from that. And like a higher profile exposure came in 1997. On May 8th, there was an episode of Friends, Julio, in which Monica dates Jon Favreau, who's trying to be the UFC champion. Do you remember this?
Yes. So I guess now I have to retcon my answer from earlier. This would have been my first exposure to UFC. But to be fair, I probably at the time wouldn't have known that was real. I mean, for all I knew, they were making it up for the show. But
they definitely. Yeah, it looks like it should be made up in the show. There was a real fighter they had Jon Favreau fight too. His name was Tank Abbott.
Yeah, he gets his ass kicked, and I think even later in the season, on a future season, he comes back and he's I don't know if he's still in the UFC, but he's made a lot of money. So UFC was a good influence in his life.
So they are scraping to get by. They were at that point owned by a company named SEG. Eventually, rules come into the play. The UFC 21 was the first introduction of like the round structure and the scoring system that would evolve into kind of what we know today. To give a date on that, though, that was 1999. So for the first 6 years in operation, everyone was just kind of like, well, just go out there and try your best. Do whatever. We'll see who wins. UFC 30 comes around, and the Ultimate Fighting Championship is purchased by a couple of very rich men named the Fertitta brothers, a company called Zuffa, which I just learned today. Zuffa means brawl in Italian. That's why they named it this. Very classy. They buy the Ultimate Fighting Championship. This is where the evil emperor Dana White comes into the fray as well, as he partners with the Fertitta brothers to see what they can do with this. Boxing, of course, for centuries has been a profitable industry, and they think they can make that out of the UFC as well. They think someone's got to be able to do something with this. UFC 30 is main evented by Tito Ortiz, who is the first really significant figure in the Ultimate Fighting Championship's history in terms of being like a star, not just like a novelty. Tito Ortiz knocked out Evan Tanner in the main event with a horrifying knockout and positioned him to be the top earner and the top star of the company. Ken Shamrock comes back into the fray as they strike gold with this Tito Ortiz Ken Shamrock dynamic. They have a very tense but also pro wrestling-esque rivalry. Tito was, at the time when he could still string a sentence together, pretty good at cutting promos, and Ken Shamrock, was natural. This culminates in UFC 40, which up until that point was the most successful event that had ever been run in mixed martial arts in the United States, and certainly the most successful UFC event ever, and is in retrospect viewed as like the turning point of realizing that this could be something big, because there was a demand for it. Steve mentioned it. There were rumblings of just, it was to the point of like casual viewers were discussing this. I also believe it's the first UFC DVD that was released, so it's got that going for it. The success of UFC 40, though, was, not without its downside, because it's not like after that things just took off to the moon. Joey, from this point on till we get to The Ultimate Fighter on Spike TV, it's a bit of a rocky road for the UFC and the Fertitta brothers and Dana White.
It is indeed. As you mentioned, UFC 40 was kind of an outlier, may be extreme, but it's much closer to an outlier than a trend, right, in terms of what followed. Like UFC 42, for example, did just a third as many of the pay-per-view buyers as UFC 40, and it was quickly apparent that the real attraction was the idea of Ortiz as a growing star, emerging star, Shamrock with his wrestling crossover, but more really importantly than that, the conflict between them, right, and that kind of pro wrestling build that you mentioned. To be specific to what we're going to talk about today and throughout this incredible journey, the first Randy Couture-Chuck Liddell fight did just 49,000 buyers, which was half of Tito and Shamrock, which gives you some perspective on how big a deal that was. Now, on the bright side, they still had Tito Ortiz, who was kind of the face of this movement, but that was about to change pretty dramatically, because while he was kind of the shining star at this point, his decline would immediately follow the Shamrock triumph, like directly so. He lost to both our coaches for season 1 of the Ultimate Fighter, and those were both, big events and big fights, but obviously it wasn't exactly ideal that they'd just established this name that was like vaguely entering pop culture, and immediately he's toppled, and he would never get back there either. So it wasn't even like there was this kind of triumphant redemption story ahead. So I think that kind of captures the journey of the UFC to this point. Like, and I was looking at, his comeback win, he fought Patrick Cote, which is a blast from the past, and it sold just 40,000 buys, which people like winners, right? Like there's so much you said for star power and personality, but ultimately winners is the key. And I saw the number by 2004, Zuffa had lost $34 million since purchasing the promotion. And I mean, clearly, regardless of the relative pay-per-view ups and downs, something needed to change. They met in 2004 with like every possible TV network, Spike being one of them, which led to a whole bunch of meetings regarding it being too violent, regarding, can we get rid of the ground game was a common thing, which they held firm on that at least. But then this became, and has later been described as a Trojan horse for the UFC. Like, this will be our route to show people what this actually is, which again is hilarious considering what's ahead of us here, but that was the idea. And that is what brings us to this, I'll say again, that unique combination of nostalgia and shame that we will be calling the Ultimate Fighter, because, I mean, it can't be overstated. This thing doesn't go on much longer without this show coming to be, regardless of UFC 40. It would have been a flash in the pan and nothing more. Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
You think about Julio, that number he just cited there, that they're close to 40 million in debt, and spoiler alert, in 2016, the Fertitas Zuffa sold the UFC for over $4 billion. So they took a risk that paid off here. And it's because reality TV was hot. That was a big part of it. The real world is always what I think of as my first exposure to the idea of reality TV. And that started, Steve, that was like the early 90s, right? That it first kicked off?
92, I believe.
So that kind of remained its own little niche for a while. But then when American Idol came along, which we have you and your people to blame for that, Joe, because that was a Simon Cowell production. But
my bad, guys.
I think it was just Idol was the name of the UK show, and so we'll just throw America on it and it'll work. And I mean, Kelly Clarkson won that, and she's still like a legitimate celebrity, so it paid off. And I remember that being like a turning point in the way television was presented, because we give them backstory. Everything's pro wrestling, dude. They're characters. They have backstories, and we want to see it. People love a winner, just like Joe said. Steve, can you tell me who the runner-up was in the first season of American Idol?
Yes, because I used to rent videos, and at Blockbuster, I would see the cover of From Kelly to Justin. So I'm assuming Justin was his second place. Justin G. I don't remember his last name.
Guarino?
Something like that.
I just thought it was Justin in all caps, like Kenta. Like I didn't know it was he had a last name. All right, so American Idol takes off, and then everything is reality TV. The surreal life, that was a big one. Steve, I know you're a fan of a certain reality show that I want to give you just a quick platform to explain the premise of, because it ties us to Spike TV here. Explain to us what the Joe Schmo Show was.
All right, the Joe Schmo Show was at the height of just millions of reality shows being on television. So they kind of worked it to where they told one guy he was on a reality show and living in the house, and everyone else in the house was an actor that was fucking with him.
Julio, are you familiar with the show?
We've talked about it briefly in either One After Hours or maybe off mic. But yeah, I mean, I remember seeing the commercials. I never sat down and watched it. And it sounded like an awesome concept. I don't know how they would pull it off, like if you would be able to pull it off back then. I mean, obviously I did. And I don't know that you could pull it off today. Like, you have to really seclude them so that they wouldn't, with the internet being what it is, I guess take their phones off, right?
Yeah, that's what they do for a lot of these shows, is they cut them off they can't even watch television most of the time.
Right.
But what they would do with Joe Schmo was, while he was doing his confessional in the booth, they would have team meetings and plot out their next moves and make adjustments and call it on the fly. Kristen Wiig was one of the people that was in that house with Joe Schmo.
Legitimate actress. Kristen
I just
Wiig.
watched it for the first time in full maybe 3 years ago, and I loved it. It was incredible television.
But that's the thing with that, because they only did the one season, right? There's only been one Joe Schmo. Really?
They did a second season in which there were two schmoes.
The lesser known Joe Schmo too.
The first, I believe, I haven't watched it yet. I have the DVD on my shelf, but I believe one of them figured it out pretty quickly. So they just brought him in on the work. Like, don't ruin it for the other one.
Well, that's what I was going to say. That was what I was going to say. Like, there is the problem with reality TV is that the first season is when you get the real people.
Right.
And then if that idea pans out and you get like a second season, that's when you get the people that have watched the first season, and so they're not, for the most part, they're being genuine. And so yeah, it makes sense. Even if you don't know you're in the Joe Schmo show, you've seen the first Joe Schmo, so maybe you're kind of looking for like that idea, like maybe I am in a show that's not what it is. It doesn't surprise me that somebody figured it out. And
I think where they messed up with Schmo 2 is that they brought back the same host. And they just try to put him in a disguise.
Put a mustache on him.
But that was, not to jump ahead with the Ultimate Fighter, but that was something that I was thinking about, Alex, because, you know, you watch these guys come into this show and so they haven't seen a previous season of the Ultimate Fighter. And
no, and one of the big things we'll be talking about throughout this series is there was never a season like this again from a production standpoint, and also like these guys essentially signed up to get tortured. Like the shit that they go through physically, that was never replicated again. Like the challenges and stuff we see, that's not a running thing with the rest of the seasons of the Ultimate Fighter.
I don't know how I feel about that.
It makes for an interesting viewing experience for this one for sure. So Joe Schmo, Spike TV, the network for men, that has aged wonderfully. The idea being we have the commercials were like women running in slow motion and shit. But what's more manly than cage fighting? You know, just beef jerky, beer, and cage fighting. So in 2004, it's announced that the Ultimate Fighting Championship has reached a deal with Spike TV. They're going to air live events on cable television, which was up until that point, the only other example of that was the Best Damn Sports Show on Fox Sports Net had Chuck Liddell and Vitor Belfort on cable, which was a very big deal at the time, but nothing on this. The idea that there was not only going to be a series of live events, but a reality show dedicated to the Ultimate Fighting Championship in which the winner gets a six-figure contract. 6 figures. That number has not changed. Even though the UFC sold for $4 billion, these fighters are still fighting for that elusive 6-figure payday. We get to January 17th of 2005, the premiere of The Ultimate Fighter. It played on Monday nights. Julio, do you know what television, the longest episodic running television program, plays on Monday nights as well?
Longest for Mondays or longest ever?
In history, baby. Longer than the Flintstones. It's Monday Night Raw.
Oh, okay. No, I was not going to guess that. Like cheaters.
All right, so Monday Night Raw serves as the lead-in to The Ultimate Fighter. This is a very significant part of the story. The urban legend perpetuated by himself is that Paul Heyman told Vince McMahon, don't let this show play after Monday Night Raw because people are going to watch it, get hooked on it, and they're going to drive away a portion of our audience. And Joe, do you believe that's true? Do you believe that the UFC drove away a portion of the World Wrestling Federation's audience?
I do. I thought you was going to ask if I thought it was true that Paul Lee saw it coming, which...
I believe that Paul Lee thinks he did that.
Yeah. I think if you had him on a lie detector, he would be telling the truth. But whether that means it is true is a very different thing. I think it is because I think it correlated with WWE leaning back towards kids, right? Like, so... Mm-hmm. This is 2005, so at this point they're still pretty edgy. But in a couple of years, they're going to make like an extreme shift in that regard, which would almost encourage people to go further with the UFC. So I think, and there is just a natural crossover with the personalities, right? And Shamrock's already kind of involved, particularly way down the line when we get to the finale. So yeah, I do think there's truth to it. I think it got a little bit overstated at times, because, frankly, professional wrestling got really, really rough on a national stage for a minute there, and people kind of tried to do the maths with that. But I still think, I think it's absolutely the case. There's so much crossover, right, in appeal. So,
and Vince McMahon and like Heyman, Vince, I believe he thinks these things. He never thought that they had the same audience. He never thought that the UFC could take away his viewers. So I'm sure he had to rationale that any way that he could. May he rest in piss. So before we get to the premiere, though, real quick, some could argue that the WWF laid the groundwork for the idea of a show like this. Steve, I do believe you're qualified to speak on the matter here. Can you give us a quick synopsis and overview of the WWF's reality show, Tough Enough?
Oh, I certainly can, Alex. Back in the spring of 2000, WWF was on an unprecedented streak of ridiculously high ratings as their contract with the USA Network was coming up. And one of the networks they began negotiating with to jump in the fall of 2000 would have been MTV, who was the home of the aforementioned Real World, and wanted to start a reality show. And from that begat Tough Enough. Tough Enough was supposed to be what we were led to believe as viewers, that it was people who were brought in off the street and taught to become professional wrestlers. Very similar layout to The Ultimate Fighter. They lived in a house. There were weekly eliminations, even though I learned during research that only 2 people were actually cut for the first season of Tough Enough. The rest voluntarily exited throughout the course of the process. The winner, it was originally meant to be 1 man and 1 woman. Nydia was the women's winner of the first season, and Maven was the winner of the men's. First season aired from June 21st to September 27th of 2001, which means I hope they had a somber post 9/11 September 20th episode.
Sure, it was real classy.
Yes, just a quick overview of those first 2 winners. Maven was around until, I believe, 2005. Yes, released in July 2005. Was a multiple-time hardcore champion, and I don't believe he had training before Tough Enough, which was unfortunate because they put him on the main roster of WWE right away to try to capitalize on this. Nydia was sent to developmental. She was sent to Ohio Valley Wrestling for a couple years before she came in as Jamie Noble's trailer park girlfriend. And
great act.
And at some point became blind. I remember on top of getting blinded by Tajiri's mist, it also straightened her hair. And as Scott Steiner was coming into the company and sexually harassing every man, woman, and child in sight, he grabbed a handful of Nydia one week. I remember that vividly. Tough Enough 2 was interesting in that everyone involved thought it was going to be 1 man and 1 woman. At the end of the finale, there were 2 men and 2 women left. Jackie Gata, Linda Miles, Kenny Lane, and Jake Sokoloff. They announced Linda Miles first, and then as the jut for the other winner came up, Jake stood up, and Jackie Gata was the winner. So the men were completely shut out. Other people who auditioned that...
Known champion of women, the World Wrestling Federation.
Yes. Other people who auditioned for that season were Shad Gaspard.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. John Hennigan, the later Johnny Nitro, Johnny UFC on Spike, and Johnny whatever else show he appears on. Shelly Martinez, Kaya Stevens, later known as Awesome Kong. Jackson Riker and Ken Anderson also auditioned for that season.
Good God.
Wow.
Yeah. Other notable people that made it onto the show was Matt Morgan, who probably did a stint in Jim Cornette's hot tub afterwards and was just around forever while not contributing jack shit to the later scheme of wrestling. Yeah, the last actual season, as we knew it at the time, was Tough Enough 3, which was won by John Hennigan, who came back for another round of punishment, and Matt Capitelli. John Hennigan is probably the most successful of the Tough Enough winners easily, and probably of the Tough Enough contestants, period.
Yeah.
Matt Capitelli, unfortunately, passed away. He was discovered to have a brain tumor while he was in Ohio Valley Wrestling. Actually, he got hit with a chair and went to the hospital for that concussion. And while they were there, they found the tumor.
Jesus.
Yeah, it's pretty rough. That would have been in early 2006. It was not that year. It was the second season, I think. No, it was season 3. There was a mentally challenged woman who actually made it into the house. Like, she was one of the contestants. She suffered a psychotic breakdown during filming. I don't know why the other contestants were at dinner without her, but she was there by herself and ended up on the roof and challenging people and throwing herself against the walls of the house. They had to call her father to come pick her up, and she swore not to know who he was. Ended up on a 5250 72-hour hold. While her parents were trying to get her out of there, she escaped custody inside LAX, shutting down a wing of the airport.
We might be covering the wrong show.
This is all because Taz told her promo work was bad.
And then once all this kind of settled down, she found herself in Ohio Valley Wrestling and just told them that she was sent there from Tough Enough. And they just went with it.
Of course.
Good Lord.
Last we heard of Lisa was at a series of shows in California in September 2002, where she managed to talk her way backstage and was even allowed to assist with pyro for the entrances. So at some point, somebody figured out that she's the one who got kicked out of Tough Enough, and her picture went on the wall with a big circle with a line through it.
Amazing.
Do not let her through. Wow. So yeah, that's Tough Enough as a reality show. There was one more, if you want to call it a season of Tough Enough, right before the Ultimate Fighter in the fall/winter of 2004, which was just a segment on SmackDown, which they did physical challenges, and that had some fun bits, such as Kurt Angle almost getting his arm broken on TV by Daniel Puder, who was the eventual winner. But the most successful person out of that was Mike the Miz Misanin. He's going to be the only person to be in both Hall of Fames, the Real World and the Tough Enough. He has been with WWE ever since. So that would be the end of 2004. So we are 20 years into Miz Mania now.
Coming up on the big 2-0 of the Miz. Unbelievable. I didn't realize we were celebrating 2 anniversaries here. So that is Tough Enough. Sets the groundwork in some aspects for the Ultimate Fighter. Because the Ultimate Fighter was abbreviated TUF, me and my friends called it Tough Enough for quite a while. But the difference being this shit's real and wrestling's fake bullshit. So how do you really... The reality aspect of it was very weird. This is how you sell. Oh, if you sold like that in the ring, I'd potato you. Triple H on there thinking he's all fucking cool. Douchebag. All right. This is a film podcast after all, Julio. So why don't you tell me what was number one at the box office January 17th, 2005? I guess it would have been the previous Friday, but what was ruling the roost?
Well, I'm going to tell you what came out the previous weekend or the previous week. So you can tell me, you can guess which movie ended up at the top. All right.
It's January, so probably slim pickings, but let's see.
Yeah, this is where you dump everything that was not worthy of the holidays. So opening January 14th, we saw Elektra, that Daredevil spinoff starring Jennifer Garner, Racing Stripes, the movie with live action animals, but they have voices. Coach Carter, starring Samuel L. Jackson. I think he's a basketball coach in that one. House of Flying Daggers. It's a kung fu movie. It was probably American release. It already come out internationally. In Good Company, expanded. That had been a Christmas release, and it got an expansion. That's the one with Topher Grace and Dennis Quaid. Topher Grace is Quaid's boss, even though he's like half his age.
I can see the poster for it. Quaid looks really annoyed, and Topher Grace looks very pompous. I can see it in my head.
But wait for it, Alex. Topher Grace is dating Dennis Quaid's daughter. That's what makes it good.
Twist.
Yeah. So one of those movies I just listed made it to the top. Which one do you think it is?
Is it Elektra?
Oh my God. Do you not remember how reviled that movie is? Everybody hated Elektra. It made it to number 5, though.
Okay. No idea. What was number 1?
From 5 to 1, Elektra was 5. Number 4 was In Good Company. Number 3 was Racing Stripes. Number 2 was Meet the Fockers, which was a big holiday hit.
Still and hanging strong.
Number 1, Don't Mess with Nick Fury. Coach Carter took the top. Would it stay at the top? I'll let you know next episode. But it was Coach Carter Mania had started right before the Ultimate Fighter dropped its first episode.
There's someone who went and saw Coach Carter and then went home to watch the first episode of The Ultimate Fighter. They're out there somewhere, man.
It was the same guy that watched Carlito's Way and then went to see the first UFC fight.
I was kind of hoping that you were going to tell me that Return of the King was still number 1, a year and a half later. Something important to call out here briefly before we finally dive into our subject du jour is that these numbers we're throwing around, this desperate attempt for television, just trying, fighting for air that the UFC was doing. This is not indicative of the MMA landscape at large. It's very important to call out because history, sadly, is written by the winners, and the UFC already has. They fuck with history more than like the WWF in terms of like, this is what happened. This is what happened. This is actually, what was popular. It wasn't. Pride Fighting Championships, which for those of you who don't know, is the greatest sports organization that has ever existed, was thriving. 2 weeks before the show premiere, they had their Shockwave event at the Saitama Super Arena that drew just short of 50,000 attendees. So MMA was working just fine on a global scale. It's domestically and for the purposes of the UFC brand, they were just having a hard time finding their audience. Pride Fighting Championships at that time also housed, you got to think, the majority of who were regarded as the best fighters in the world at that point. You had the Nogs, Fedor, Krokop, Shogun Hua, Vanderlei Silva. It was a different time. Joey, the Shockwave event, I was looking at the card. That is the event where Ryo Chonin submitted Anderson Silva with that flying scissors heel hook.
Wow, which was like one of the early YouTube kind of explosions when it came to, because once Anderson became king, you'd have the video, right, when Anderson Silva got caught in Pride Fighting Championships. So yeah, that's a crazy time. Those shows they've still never been replicated. Firstly, obviously in pageantry. That's like what everyone does. But also the way those cards were built was completely different. Like just an entirely different presentation every which way. And it's never been caught up to since. It is incredible to imagine this, what we're about to talk about, being at the same time as those events, which are like, have aged so well and have this timeless appeal. Very, very different.
Yeah, Julio, just I guess for a little bit of context, like Pride was a Japanese-based company, like any good Japanese-based company, funded largely by organized crime. But if you go back and watch shows from like the early 2000s, like I'm talking like 01, 02, the production values of those shows are like equivalent to like modern WrestleManias almost, in terms of just like the pageantry is the word, the giant sets, the video screens. It's you want to talk about a pro wrestling presentation. They gave like every show almost seemed like a Super Bowl type atmosphere. It was good shit. That card also had, I believe, the lone mixed martial arts fight of Olympic gold medalist Rulon Gardner, which is just an insane little footnote. He fought Hidehiko Yoshida because, again, Pride was a place for the sickos, as we like to say nowadays. Leading in to the Ultimate Fighter, as we'll do on each episode of this, the Raw recap. What wet the palate for folks? Well, it was La Resistance and Maven defeating Rosie, Shelton Benjamin, and the Hurricane in 3 minutes and 35 seconds. Shawn Michaels defeating Christian with Tyson Tomko in 6:21. That's probably a good match. Dave Batista, who surprisingly will kind of be a player in this journey that we're doing, defeated Viscera in 2:30. That sounds about 2:29 too long. Chris Jericho defeated Chris Benoit in 12:30, and Gene Snitsky and Kane in a no holds barred match ended in a no contest to take us off the air.
Wow,
was that like a cliffhanger? Like
I don't even. I'm just reading the words. And I'm like, how do you do that? And also like. No wonder people stuck around looking for something different.
I was going to say, yeah.
Gene Snitsky and Kane.
They led him to the goal line on that one.
So did they get something different, Alex?
What?
People wanted something different, and I guess, yeah, you're right. It's different. Was it better?
Get a bunch of static shots of Vegas, sizzle reel, all these white guys talking shit. So the table's set. We have explained what the UFC was, where it was, who the players involved up to this point were, and I think done a pretty decent job of explaining or stressing that this was the Hail Mary. The show was, if it didn't succeed, it's very likely the UFC would not be around today, or would be running those small, kind of almost regional shows of the day of the their infancy. As I mentioned, January 17th, 2005. The dawn of the Ultimate Fighter. We have two coaches. The format of this is going to be team-based, even though obviously it just comes down to the last man standing. Our coaches, Chuck Liddell and Randy Couture. At that time, Chuck had to be the top draw for the company, correct?
Probably because the feud with Ortiz and the way that he came out of that as like the clear victor and hero of the story in the end. I would say so, yeah. I mean, Randy always had a more sort of understated appeal, right? Whereas Chuck, he was like the ultimate. If you imagine cage fighter, Chuck would come up pretty close, I think. So I would say so, yeah.
That's what I was going to say. To a casual fan, you put Chuck Liddell on a poster, and I want to know more about who that guy is and what he does.
What's not disputable is that in the wake of this, Chuck was their box office attraction for the next 2 years. Then GSP and so on and so forth. But Chuck became a big star out of this. So Julio, I don't know if they mentioned in the first episode here that we're covering, but the idea of this also was at the end of the season, they were going to do a pay-per-view where Chuck and Randy fought. They had fought once before. Randy Couture had won. Some of the clips they show from this, I didn't remember how bad he whooped Chuck's ass. You've never seen Chuck Liddell get manhandled like he did the first time he fought Randy.
And it wasn't just the grappling. If you remember, he outboxed him in the first fight too. It was very, very, I mean, things would change, but it was very striking. It was like the threat of the takedown. He was able to outbox him. It was very unique.
I don't think they mentioned that because what I thought was that there's going to be 2 winners of the season, and those 2 winners are going to fight. At least that's what I thought was going to happen. Is that not the case? Because they're saying 2 contracts, right? They keep saying 2 contracts. So I just assume 1 from each team.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we have our 16 competitors. 8 of them are in one weight class and 8 of them are in another. So the idea is that...
Oh, that makes sense then.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So our 2 coaches, Chuck and Randy. Team Liddell is comprised of 4 light heavyweights being Bobby Southworth, Sam Hoger, Forrest Griffin, and Alex Schonauer. His middleweights being Josh Koscheck, Diego Sanchez, Kenny Florian, and John Rafferty. That lineup of those 4 names is like that meme of the like it's 3 guys in military fatigues and then a guy in a clown outfit. That's Randy, on the other hand, his light heavyweights consisted of Stephan Bonner, Mike Swick, Luden Kincaid, and Strange Brew, Jason Thacker. His middleweights, Nate Quarry, Chris Lieben, Alex Karalexis, and Chris Sanford. With Nate Quarry, I couldn't remember if it showed, if it was like it came through on screen, but if you read like contemporary articles and stuff, it was thought that he was going to be the winner because he was Randy's guy. He was in Team Quest with Randy already and been training. We'll get to Quarry down the road and kind of his fate in the show, but I think from the jump he was kind of an early standout to win.
Quick question about Couture, Alex, because so for the
Expendables,
yes, that's what I was going to ask you. Like, at what point does he make the jump to movies? So people would never recognize his name from movies at all here, right?
No, and I'm glad you said to movies and not to acting, because I wouldn't call what he does particularly riveting. Randy, boys, you might be able to help me with this. Was The Expendables like his first movie? It was the first one of note for sure.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, he may have done some a lot of the MMA fighters do horrific DVD projects, but yes, definitely his first thing that people have seen. Yeah, I would say.
Was he on that episode of The King of Queens where Doug encountered the UFC fighters?
Yes.
It was, yeah.
It was like Randy, the Rampage was on there too. Dan Henderson, because the bit was Dan Henderson took his teeth out. Okay. He was in Red Belt, which Red Belt is a pretty good movie.
Yeah.
So he was,
I think it is important. I think, unfortunately, because of the way things are done with the UFC and changing history, I think there's a whole generation of fans now that don't even realize how big of a deal Randy was. Like, his deal was like Captain America. He was like everyone's favorite fighter. It's kind of lost on people now. And one of the things, Julio, to your confusion about the coaches fighting, in your defense, this show would eventually become kind of built around the idea that the coaches hated each other. But Chuck and Randy are just kind of like, these fellas look pretty good, they're just kind of hanging out. That is an interesting thing about this that I'd forgotten. But yeah, that makes it kind of different.
Yeah, that's a good call. We do need to give Randy his propers also, because I talked about Chuck Liddell becoming the box office star of the company for a few years. Randy, he's an example of Julio, what we were referencing, and the idea of the UFC rewriting history and to favor, their perspective. Because Randy's a guy that consistently had contractual battles with them, and he basically knew he was an independent contractor, so he'd take sponsorships, endorsements where they didn't want him to. He was in a video game they didn't want him to be in. He just is one of the figures that they probably would prefer you don't remember, but he was an absolute force. At this point, he would have been 43, somewhere in there, I think.
Yeah.
So he was old. The idea for like the sport, he was an older man, but he had a few years there. He ended his career as probably like a, batting 500, but he, at this point in particular, was just like a force. He was a wrestler predominantly, and the Chuck Liddell we mentioned, and Tito Ortiz, who he beat for the title, man, he just threw him all around. And this was when Tito was good, and he had absolutely no answer for him. Definitely a seminal figure for those who know ball. Joe, how much did it throw you off to see Mike Swick being billed as a light heavyweight?
Right, because I remember, we'll eventually tell everyone's tale, but yeah, I remember Swick being like a rangy welterweight predominantly. There's a few. That was always a thing with the Ultimate Fighter because of the weight cutting element, which will certainly come up and is kind of one of the show's more famous pieces throughout the years. Guys would often fight above their conventional weight class. At one point, even Randy says, right, I have like one actual 205 on my team. So it was, and that's kind of a strange deal. I mean, there's also Kenny Florian. Like, what in the world, dude? He's a middleweight here. Like,
yeah. For the purposes of what we're talking about, Julio, Kenny Florian here is fighting at 185 pounds, and his like where he would end up fighting was at 145 pounds, where he like worked best. The idea was just these guys had never expected the shot before, so they, either bulked up or slimmed down when they needed to. But we got a few natural big boys in here, like Forrest Griffin and Stephen Bonner.
I knew I recognized that name. And Joe, when Joe said it, it reminded me that I thought that while I was watching the show. Kenny Florian is the same Kenny Florian from BattleBots, right? He's one of the commentators in BattleBots.
Currently Googling BattleBots.
Dude, BattleBots is amazing.
Yes, he is the current co-host for BattleBots.
Since
Love
when?
it. Dude, this is pre-pandemic.
Good for Kenny Florian. My God.
BattleBots is like it's like the UFC, but with little robots.
Right.
But the fights are real. It's not staged. It's just like the
hazards
UFC.
are real. I got a call from some producer, and he was telling me about this show called BattleBots. If I've ever been part of it, if I've ever seen it, I was like, yeah, I saw it in the early 2000s on Comedy Central. That's apparently how he ended up getting the gig. So, Julio, dropping knowledge.
Wasn't Mick Foley a BattleBots host at some point?
Sounds like Mick.
You want to talk about a guy not above a payday, brother?
Yeah, I was expecting him to show up on this show for a second.
All right, so we'll recap this episode in part 2 as well, because we've spent a lot of time, laying the groundwork here. The Wikipedia page for this is just filled with little nuggets of joy. So we'll read the bullet points for episode 1 here. The 16 fighters are driven to the UFC training center in Las Vegas, Nevada, where they meet Willa Ford, Dana White, and the coaches Randy Couture and Chuck Liddell. At the house, Chris Lieben drinks heavily and starts to make fun of Jason Thacker and giving people nicknames. At 2 a.m., while Thacker is in the shower, Lieben decides to urinate on his teammate's pillow without him noticing. The fighters are woken up at 5 a.m. by Couture and Liddell, and the first day of training proves too much for almost half of the fighters. During the jiu-jitsu training, Nate Quarry cuts himself on the chin after landing a takedown. On the second day of training, Thacker talks to Couture and says that the training is too much for him, but Couture talks him into staying and trying to get the training done. On the fourth day, everyone is ready to spar except for Thacker because of the training. So Bobby Southworth and Ludinson Cade decide to talk him into going with them, saying they need him and he is part of the team. While Forrest Griffin and Stephen Bonner are sparring, Griffin accidentally headbutts Bonner, causing a need for stitches. The light heavyweight and middleweight teams are chosen by coaches Liddell and Couture. Joe and Steve, this is for both of y'all, because Julio, I know you're going to kind of ease into this and kind of realize what's what as we go on here. Dude, Forrest and Stefan are sparring at like 150%.
Right.
And then when Stefan gets cut, it cuts to this talking head of him and he goes, I can't believe this happened. And then it shows them like they look like they're in a fucking bar fight with gloves on, man.
Is that the one where the coach tells the other coach, hey, keep an eye on him because he's going too hard? Okay.
Yeah.
The training aspect of this, Steve, this is a revisiting for you. It's safe to say that the gentlemen that participate and the eventual females that participate in the Ultimate Fighter were never quite pushed to the physical extremes that our cast here in the first season was.
No, I wrote here that they were doing 2-a-days for 3 hours in each session. So that's 6 hours of training like that. I actually met Stephen Bonner. He came to a Paradigm show of the first time we did the UWFI rules. And he is rest in peace, Stefan, a very large gentleman, and Forrest looks right there at about the same height. So it's just these two mastodons just throwing in an empty warehouse for nobody in particular, just getting wrecked for the love of the game. On top of the treadmill workouts he described, where you're going up to 10 miles an hour at one point. Like, no, why would you do this and then fight? It seems like a recipe for injuries just all over the place. They're lucky they didn't have more. Stitches, where the way they were throwing, somebody was going to get hurt. There's no way around that.
No
They're
headgear.
lucky. Yeah, they're lucky that they didn't have blown ACLs and various other joint injuries the way they were pushing those guys.
And also the level of hungover that Lieben was, you could just see it on his face, and he was pushing himself. It's there's that's like the Jordan flu game to an extent. You got to respect it a little bit. Joey, wouldn't be early 2000s if we didn't have a little bit of bodily fluid humor on a reality TV show.
It sure wouldn't be. We get a ton of it here. It's like a greatest hits compilation. It's the biggest thing about the training to me is not even the training. It's Dana with the stopwatch. Who's like,
dude, Dana is a wealth of comedy here.
And entirely unintentional too. Like, so severe with every single thing he says. Because that's what you're reminded of when you watch this, is their approach in terms of explaining the sport to the public wasn't like the skill or artistry so much as it was, God, these guys are tough. It was kind of there. And there's Dana just like... And I will say, you mentioned Chris Lieben. This is not a very flattering presentation for him, it's fair to say. I think, I think he would
quite an
co-sign
understatement.
that. Yeah, he would co-sign that. And it's aged really, really badly.
Yeah.
But he does have that one moment where he completes the... when he does it, right? When Dana's alongside him with the stopwatch and he collapses to the floor afterwards in training. And it is kind of a sign of kind of things to come with him in terms of he's just sheer mental toughness, because he's in the worst state of all of them going into that gym, right? So, I don't know.
That's the story of his career, is the
right.
Succeed on toughness alone.
Yes, against many, many demons, right? And that's the thing is, some of this stuff is... Some of the stuff that's played for laughs right out of the gate has like, it's not to say that it ever was good or kind to these fellas, but God, it's aged worse and worse, right, as everyone's stories unraveled. So it's a unique deal in that regard. I think there's a lot of elements to this you kind of grimace at and cringe at.
Yeah, that was like a staple of the reality TV show boom, was the drunk character, and I understand that there's probably nothing else to do in that house but drink, but Jesus, we're only at this point, we're 2 episodes in, and Lieben's, floating his liver away here. Yeah. We do have Mark Lehman as one of the side coaches. Mark Lehman's a fucking douchebag, and it doesn't take long for that to come through. I don't know if any of y'all noticed, but he's monitoring like a rolling session, and it might have been Bobby Southworth, somebody tries to do a judo throw, like a head throw, the headlock that Ronda Rousey would be famous for, and he goes, "No judo, that doesn't work." He's one of those guys that
he was famous, and I think most people, if they haven't seen this season, if that name's familiar to them, I think the Matt Serra clip is still like, it's probably got like millions of views on YouTube, which is a few seasons down the line, right? That's like an infamous Ultimate Fighter moment. He comes across exactly as you'd imagine here out the gate.
A couple quick notes here. The free merch they gave to the guys to wear, it's like the event shirt for UFC 22 with Frank Shamrock and Tito Ortiz. I'm like, can I have one of those, please? And an important thing to keep an eye on as we move through this series is Dana White fit check. Dana is just wearing insane outfits here. One of my notes just says Dana in shorts, because I don't remember ever seeing Dana White in shorts.
The very first thing I wrote was Dana 5 o'clock shadow.
This is before he got his teeth done, too. And he's also super thin. He looks like if there was a movie about Dana White and he got sick, that's what he looks like here.
He's before any, because now he's like, the way his image is now is like this sort of fearless, this fearless, ruthless. And he certainly was ruthless, but he's like super timid here on camera, right? Like he's just kind of, it's interesting.
Well, they all look very awkward in front of the camera. I don't know if it, as the seasons progress, they get more comfortable. Even the host, the lady that comes in and kind of gives the instructions or whatever. I was like,
it's bad. Yeah.
A little bit of rehearsal could have done better. I have a question, Alex, before you go forward, because I'm really curious about how you guys experience this. And I already, I guess, kind of know the answer, but they revealed the roster. You're seeing the opening credits, and you guys seem to be familiar with everybody on the cast. So it's like, this is not just one season. I'm guessing most of the people on the show, whether they win or not, they go on to have careers to where you guys, like, the average viewer, the average MMA fan would recognize him? Or is it that you guys are so hardcore that you know even like these people that never amounted to anything past the show, but you know them because you just know?
I think it's fair to say at least half of this cast went on to have a notable career that casual fans would recognize their names.
Okay.
Partly because the show gave them such exposure. They were like valuable parts of the roster coming in because the show was a hit, right? So I think that's also part of it. I mean, this is the early days. The roster was a lot smaller then. So if you could have a handful of guys in the undercard, the guys that fans knew, they would get opportunities because of that.
Okay, so that adds to the value of somebody that's into MMA to watch it, because then you get to see, their early days. I didn't know anybody. This was just a bunch of people that I didn't know, and some of them stood out.
Florian.
But even just now, I recognize like why. It's like the name sounds familiar. Some of them, there's like, what is it, 14 people, 16 people, right? 16 in the house? Yeah, 16. And the episodes are like not even an hour. So it takes that first episode, not knowing anybody, just like the ones that get the spotlight to stand out are the ones that you're going to remember for the next episode. So really, like, Chris Levin stands out. I mean, he gets a lot of screen time, but he also gets to do the most outrageous things. So you're going to, if you don't know anything about MMA, you're going to remember him. That, and then obviously the Canadian guy.
Strange Brew.
Yeah, Strange Brew, because, he has sort of a storyline. And then everybody else is just like a bunch of dudes that are drinking and telling you how tough they are.
And there are 16 interesting stories that follow this. I think when it's done, Julio, and we kind of give you go through this journey with us, and then we explain kind of what the Ultimate Fighter show became, I think you'll see that this season was an outlier, not just in the success terms, but in terms of like the talent that was bred from it. Is that safe to say, Joe?
I think so. Yeah, I would say maybe down the line when the
season 5 is a lot. There's a lot of success that came from season 5,
and when they would do stuff like the newer divisions, like the season where like John Dodson and TJ Dillashaw would emerge as threats at the lower weights, or when they would get the women involved, like that obviously is a different thing because those divisions were so young at the time they did those seasons. But I mean, light heavyweight was the glamour division, and middleweight, of course, was a staple. So the fact they was able to add a bunch of names from this first season, I think absolutely so, yeah.
And a couple, not to the level of superstardom, but there's some box office attractions that are born from the show as well.
Yeah.
I think a good way to end episode 1 here is one of the quotes I wrote down, in which Nate Quarry says, "We are now entering the Ultimate Fighting College."
And that's the only college most of these guys will ever see.
Thank you for listening to this episode of TUFtwenty. A reminder to subscribe to the podcast, visit wearethecontrarians.com, and follow the Contrarians across social media at Contrarian Prime.
You can also follow Alex individually at Contrarian Alex, and you can check out our other special projects on our Patreon channel at patreon.com/Contrarian Prime. If you want to listen to Alex teach me about The Rock and John Cena, that's where you need to go.
You can catch me weekly on the Late Night Grin, live and free on YouTube every Friday night. In addition, Alex and I collaborate monthly on Grin Grappler, discussing some of pro wrestling's biggest and baddest. If those grins are for you, check out LNG Gold, our YouTube membership plan that includes over 50 hours of exclusive content each month.
You can follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at NotDrDeath. That's NotDreath. Or you can block me now and save us both a lot of embarrassment.
Until next time, be sure to make your coaches proud and don't call anyone a fatherless bastard.